Well, we finally have a little bit of positive news. So during a DSA forum in New York City, Representative AOC committed to cut off all funding for Israel entirely, including, and this is key, funding for their Iron Dome. Now, this is significant because, as political strategist Chris Sosa put it, her commitment could echo across the Democratic Party because she's considered a mainstream politician and a serious contender for president. And he argues that this could now become a litmus test for other 2028 contenders as well, which is important because opportunistic politicians who want to run for president are already trying to obscure their complicity with Israel's genocide by creating a special exception for defensive weapons, so that way voters think that they're not necessarily helping Israel perpetuate crimes against humanity. Rather, they're simply giving Israel the capability to defend its own civilians. But that argument is horseshit because Israel already has the ability to do that. Palestinians, on the other hand, do not. Palestinians have rocks. Israelis have tanks, and Israeli civilians have bomb shelters, whereas Palestinians in Gaza have nowhere to go if and when Israel chooses to carpet bomb them. So giving Israel so-called defensive weapons while they commit a genocide in Palestine and ethnic cleansing in Lebanon would be like giving the Nazis defensive weapons during World War II because you were concerned about German civilians. Like, you can't embolden a regime that is committing atrocities. But that's the expectation from Israel's morally bankrupt defenders who are now accusing AOC of being immoral because of this new stance. For example, Guy Benson of Fox News ironically accused her of racism, writing on Twitter, "Iron Dome, purely defensive, saves so many innocent lives, and AOC is now apparently committed to defunding it. Wrong types of lives that system is saving, it seems." Right, definitely a good faith argument by somebody who cares about civilian lives. But I think this is why AOC originally was hesitant about taking this position, because this cynical response was going to be inevitable from genocide-supporting monsters who are going to try to say anything to get the United States government to materially support a country doing a genocide. If they have the guilt trip politicians doing it, they're going to do that too. But this argument, regardless of what they say, is complete horseshit. As Dylan Saba argues in an article for Jewish Currents, the Iron Dome cannot meaningfully be considered life-saving in any value system that recognizes Palestinian humanity. And he goes on to quote analyst Nathan Thrall, who adds, "In theory, a weapon like Iron Dome could be used only defensively, but in practice, it doesn't work that way. Iron Dome facilitates greater Israeli offensive measures because it lowers the perceived cost to Israel of escalating or extending or initiating attacks. In other words, while the Iron Dome may prevent the deaths of Israeli non-combatants, it has made it easier for Israel to engage in deadly operations that take Palestinian lives." And Saba goes on to argue, rather than preserving space for diplomacy, Iron Dome enables Israel's commitment to the status quo of permanent occupation. Its ultimate function is to entrench an already asymmetrical conflict into a state of ongoing bloodshed, dispossession, and devastation for the Palestinians of Gaza. And therein lies the problem with us funding their Iron Dome. Someone on Twitter described it as giving a school shooter body armor. If you force them to defend themselves, they can't inflict as much damage as they want to. And that's kind of the logic here, right? The goal isn't to let Israeli non-combatants die, it's to force Israel to defend them, which takes time away from them being aggressive. And if they're less shielded from retaliation, they'll be more apprehensive about bombing every single fucking country in their vicinity with impunity. And even though I think this is pretty obvious, the supposed humanitarians all of a sudden calling AOC a monster, they would never agree to an Iron Dome for Palestinians or people in Lebanon. So let's not pretend like these motherfuckers care about innocent civilians when they enthusiastically support crimes against humanity. But to go back to AOC, she is forcing Democratic presidential hopefuls to contend with the substance of this issue, which is important because up until this point, they've been able to get away with their support for Israel by saying, oh, it's just defensive. No, actually listen to what you're saying and contend with the arguments being made by people who say you should cut this regime off entirely. Now, on top of that, it also proves that AOC is listening to her constituents, which is great because even though she's been comparatively good on this issue, she still has a lot of blind spots that make her weaker on this issue than, say, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Summer Lee. As Julia Conley of Common Dreams explains, she switched her vote from no to present in a 2021 funding package for Israel's Iron Dome, and she also voted for a resolution that defined criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, and she later voted against an amendment to defund Israel's Iron Dome, although she did later vote against against the entire bill itself. But essentially, she defended her support for defensive weapons of Israel at the time, arguing that, it would add to the death count if Israel's Iron Dome was defunded. And I even criticized her for it at the time because it was an argument that was wrong, and it felt like she wasn't listening to her colleagues like Rashida Tlaib and critics of Israel who say you can't fund a regime in any capacity carrying out atrocities. But now I want to give her credit because she's very clearly listening to her critics, and she adapted, which is exactly what you want more politicians to do. So I think this is incredibly significant, one, because her standing in the Democratic Party means that others are going to have to take this position at least more seriously, and two, because Israel is somehow more unhinged than ever before, and cutting them off entirely couldn't be more important. The Knesset just passed a law this week which lets them give the thousands of Palestinian hostages in their custody the death penalty by hanging. And after the law was passed, Ben-Gvir, who was in Netanyahu's government, was popping champagne while him and his buddies were wearing noose pins to celebrate its passage. And it's not like the depravity here is surprising, seeing as how this regime is committing a genocide after all, but I don't think people truly understand how abhorrent and racist this law is. Israel outlawed the death penalty decades ago, but they brought it back now in 2026 specifically for Palestinian hostages, which includes doctors and children. They have thousands of people that they've taken hostage. Media never talks about them, but now those people can be killed by Israel. As former South African politician Andrew Feinstein put it, not even apartheid South Africa codified executions for only one race group. And AJ Plus released this infographic explaining that this law is reminiscent of a barbaric law instituted by British colonizers back in the 1930s so they could sentence more than 100 Palestinians to death for daring to resist their occupation. And AJ Plus goes on to explain that Israel hasn't prosecuted a single Israeli settler since 2020 for killing Palestinians. Meanwhile, Palestinian defendants who are tried in military courts have a 99% conviction rate, which is why Human Rights Watch said that this law is a transparent attempt to kill Palestinian detainees faster and with less scrutiny. And Ofer Kassif, who is an Israeli member of the Knesset, described this as a genocide law, full stop.
The law doesn't appeal to Jews because those who propose the law believe and say that explicitly that there's no such a thing like Jewish terrorism. And by definition, accordingly, there's no such a thing like Jewish terrorists. That means the Jews, a priori, are excluded from the appeal of this law. On the other hand, they say, again, explicitly, that all Palestinians are terrorists, if not at present, in potential. The chair of the Interior Committee at the Knesset said explicitly and literally a couple of days ago that there aren't any innocent people in Jenin nor innocent children in Jenin. That means again that all Palestinians are terrorists. And if this law says that terrorists should be executed and all Palestinians are regarded by them as terrorists, that means, in other words, logically speaking, that all Palestinians should be executed. We have to say something very clear. That's not a death penalty law. That's a genocide law.
So you have an Israeli politician very clearly exposing how this law will be used as a justification to exterminate Palestinians, and yet most American politicians are still arguing with a straight face that it's wrong to cut off this regime, even though they're now going further than South Africa went during apartheid. And Mustafa Barghouti of the Palestinian National Initiative spelled this out very clearly on CNN for an American audience that desperately needs to understand what's happening.
The death penalty law is another sign of how far Israel is going in the direction of creating a terrible apartheid system. A much worse apartheid than what prevailed in South Africa at one point of time. Even the apartheid horrible regime at the time in South Africa did not dare to say that if a black man kills a white man, he will be taken to he will be executed. But if a white man kills a black man, he will not be. What Israel did is exactly that, saying that a Palestinian could be sentenced to death penalty, but an Israeli no, for the same crime.
Yeah, but as Israel enshrines hyper-apartheid into law and Jim Crow 2.0 into law, the same politicians who support that have the audacity to accuse AOC of being the immoral one. It's just so goddamn unserious. But this is why there's this effort to try to prey upon people who care about social justice issues and tie Zionism to Judaism, and why, anti-Zionism is more important than ever, because defenders of Israel, they've tried to tie Zionism to Judaism, even though Zionism is a relatively new ideology, whereas Judaism has existed for thousands of years. But the trick, you see, is to make people think that criticism of Zionism and Israel are synonymous with anti-Semitism, because the people who are often opposed to settler colonialism, leftists, are more likely to be opposed to bigotry, broadly speaking. But that conflation is not just cynical, it's deeply problematic, and Israeli scholar Avi Shlaim explains why Zionism and Judaism obviously are not the same thing.
Zionism is racism. Israel cannot be both. Israel is either a racist Jewish state, or it's a democratic state for everybody. And that's what I would like Israel to be. I'd like a democratic solution, one state with equal rights for all its inhabitants. Apartheid is racism. Apartheid is discrimination. But Israel is the only member of the United Nations that I know which is officially racist. And I say this because of the July 2018 nation-state law, which says the Jews have a unique right to self-determination in Israel. Unique means exclusive.
Yes.
It means Arabs have no right to self-determination. It means even if Arabs became a majority, they would still have no right to self-determination. So most certainly Zionism is a racist ideology, and it is largely responsible for the Nakba that has unfolded throughout the last century and continues today.
So make no mistake about it, the Israel defenders who are trying to inextricably link Zionism to Judaism, they are slandering an entire group of people. They're basically saying that all Jewish people are racist, which is immoral and dangerous, because if criticisms of a racist ideology like Zionism and an apartheid government are tantamount to anti-Semitism, you're inadvertently ascribing culpability to all Jewish people around the world who are not responsible for the crimes of the Israeli government. That's not just immoral, it's fucking dangerous because it fuels anti-Semitism. But, put aside that for a moment. Another thing that we've been told is that Israel's war crimes are happening because Hamas did October 7th, and that's why Israel has to wipe out all Palestinians, even though, Israel has committed the equivalent of 60 plus October 7ths in Gaza. It doesn't matter. That justifies everything that Israel chooses to do because Hamas. But they never grapple with the reality that there's no Hamas in the West Bank, yet Palestinians in the West Bank haven't been spared from Israel's wrath, even though they don't have a Hamas. They not only bulldoze the homes of Palestinians in the West Bank, they give Israeli terrorists the green light to enact pogroms against the Palestinian people. And we're not just talking about isolated incidents here, because more than 37,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been displaced since 2025. And this effort in the West Bank has ramped up during their genocide in Gaza because that gave them cover. Everybody was focused on that and not paying as close attention to what they were doing in the West Bank. And now the Iran war is giving them cover to ethnically cleanse southern Lebanon as well. Israel just announced plans to destroy all homes in villages in southern Lebanon, and they've displaced 1.2 million people and counting, and they're expanding their border up to the Litani River. And the reason why it's being described as an ethnic cleansing is because, as the New York Times put it, they're telling Christian and Druze leaders in southern Lebanon to specifically expel Shiite Muslims. Quote, in private calls to local leaders across southern Lebanon, Israeli military officials have assured several Christian and Druze communities that they could remain in the evacuation zone. They have pressed them, however, to force out any Lebanese from neighboring Shiite Muslim communities who have sought refuge among them, as Israeli bombardments flattened Shiite towns, according to local Christian, Druze, and Shiite leaders who spoke to the New York Times. The Shiites make up the majority of southern Lebanon. So this is what we're contending with here. We are looking at a textbook ethnic cleansing, not to mention an indiscriminate bombing campaign of Beirut, which is a city of more than 2 million people. And just to put things into perspective, the population of Beirut is more than three times larger actually than Portland, Oregon, which is my city. And if a single bomb went off in Portland, I couldn't imagine how the city would recover from that. It would be disastrous. There's so many people. It feels so densely populated. But in Beirut, it's a common occurrence. Like, look at some of the footage here from Beirut that was shared by a Lebanese commentator. Israel just bombed an apartment building, just straight up in broad daylight. They bombed a fucking residential building. And even though this war crime in particular was captured on video, it happens so much more frequently than people realize. Other apartment buildings and homes are being bombed, villages are being bulldozed, and we're not even seeing that and hearing about it oftentimes. They're also bombing medical facilities in Lebanon and committing war crimes with impunity on a daily basis in Lebanon. And this tweet from my buddy Anthony, who is a Lebanese streamer, it broke me because he says, impossible to remain positive in Lebanon. Everything about this, quote, war is so bleak. The constant barrage of bad news is a lot, and the world doesn't give a fuck, so it feels like screaming into the void as Israel steals our land and kills our people. But Israel is doing this in Lebanon because everybody else is preoccupied with Iran, understandably so. But the amount of pain and suffering caused by this racist, terrorist regime isn't just limited to Palestinians and Iranians. Their neighbors in Lebanon are also under attack as well, and we need to make sure that their plight isn't being forgotten, because if my city was being bombed with impunity and nobody in the international community seemed to care, I genuinely don't know how I would grapple with that. It would be nightmarish. But people are very understandably distracted by Iran because of what the U.S. and Israel are doing. It is genuinely unspeakable. Like, the rules of engagement simply do not exist anymore. We've reverted back to barbarism, and we're just carpet bombing Tehran, which is a city of 10 million people. And there's truly no limits to the depravity. As CNN's Sana Noor Haq reports, U.S. and Israeli forces bombed a fucking orphanage. I'm going to repeat that. They bombed an orphanage, and they're destroying residential buildings with impunity, of course, because they don't care about who they harm. Like this woman's home, you can tell that her home was probably beautiful based on what's left, but now all she has is rubble and memories because her country was invaded by foreign terrorists who don't give a fuck about what they do and what harm they cause. Like, even if the bombing stops right now, the fact that an entire city was poisoned, a city of 10 million people, poisoned because Israel bombed their oil facilities, which led to black rain. There are no words to describe the barbarity and cruelty of the Americans and the Israelis. So if you're an American concerned about higher gas prices, I'm sure that that woman would happily trade places with you. But our government and society more broadly speaking, they simply just do not view Arabs and Persians or any Muslims, be it Shia or Sunni, as equal human beings. We've been conditioned to feel indifferent to their suffering because that's reinforced through cable news and pop culture, movies and TV. And politicians, they just talk so flippantly about nuking Gaza and killing Arabs. And when they say shit like that, it's barely a headline. Like, we have been conditioned to pretend as if these folks in this region are not equal human beings. But even if you reject their culture of dehumanization and you do view them as equal human beings, you're still being told on a daily basis that their suffering is somehow justified because of who their government is. Like, that would never apply to us. We have a terrible fascist government in Donald Trump's regime, but nobody would say that Americans deserve to be bombed or murdered or displaced because of it. But when it comes to people in the Middle East, well, they deserve what they get because of who their government is. And this is a bit off topic, but just listen to what Marco Rubio said about Iran, because what he said here nearly made my fucking head explode.
Imagine an Iran that instead of spending their wealth, billions of dollars supporting terrorists or weapons, had spent that money helping the people of Iran. You'd have a much different country.
I mean, he either has the least amount of self-awareness of any human being to have ever existed, or he's just fucking trolling us, because the same exact thing can obviously be said for the United States. Imagine if instead of spending billions of dollars on weapons for Israeli terrorism, the United States helped its own people. I mean, Israel has universal health care. It's free at the point of service, whereas we don't. Tens of thousands of Americans die every single year due to a lack of health care. Meanwhile, Republicans want to cut health spending by another $2 billion so they can have more money for terrorism in Iran. It's just a sick and twisted joke, and I feel like I'm probably a little bit early with this take, so I think it's a hot take, but I'm going to give it to you either way because I sincerely believe that these two terrorists are going to be remembered as the modern-day equivalent of these two terrorists. Trump even has his own Gestapo putting immigrants in concentration camps while he pursues global conquest. But at the same time, Netanyahu also has concentration camps that are seemingly going to turn into death camps given the new law. So, I'll let you decide who's Hitler and who's Mussolini. But my broader point is that all of this has to be rejected. And we need at least one fucking party in this country to stand up and say enough is enough. So that is why I'm pleased to see AOC get on board with a full weapons embargo, because anything short of a full embargo is just not sufficient, because any support to Israel, including defensive weapons, is just a tacit endorsement of all of their heinous conduct in the region.